we'll begin. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to EVCOM's latest webinar. It's our first after the summer break. We allowed ourselves a month off. So this is the first one of the new season. We are discussing inside internal comms this afternoon, and we have a great panel. We will be facilitated by Rebecca Leonard from the Sequel Group. And the panel itself is made up of Julie Sanders, also from the Sander, singular, not plural, Sander from the Sequel Group as well, Naz Sadri from Merchant Cantos, and Jane Sayers from Shell. Before we begin, if I could just let you know how we're going to work this. There is the Q&A option, so if anybody does have any questions as we go along, if you could just put them into the Q&A section, we will monitor those, and if appropriate, we will try and get them answered in the moment, but otherwise we will leave them to the end and we'll go through them at that point. We will anticipate finishing at about 4:45. We may run over by a few minutes, but we do try and stick to the time. And there isn't an opportunity, unfortunately, in this system to ask questions directly. So you are required to use the Q&A function. Could I also just flag at this point, because I know we have some regular listeners, people who come back to many of our webinars, the webinar that we had set up for next week, the to office or not to office, has been postponed due to the recent announcements of suggesting people work from home. We didn't think it was quite the right time for that one, so we'll push that one back a bit. But without further ado, we'll get on to today's subject, and I'll hand you over to Rebecca, who will then introduce you to the rest of the panel in a bit more detail. So Rebecca, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. Yeah, hi and welcome everyone. As Claire mentioned, I'm Becky. I'm going to be facilitating the chat for the next 30-40 minutes or so. But yeah, please do let us know if you have any questions in the box, and I will get round to sharing them with the rest of the panel. So yeah, we're going to start by just doing a really quick introduction to everyone, and I will kick off. So as mentioned, I'm Becky Leonard, and I'm the Insight and Content Manager at Sequel Group. Sequel Group is an employee experience agency, usually based in London, but at the moment based all over the place for the considerable future by the sounds of it. And as part of our Insight team, I support on our strategic work from communication audits to planning, and also work on our content, so writing for internal campaigns and publications. So Jane, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, thanks Becky. So I'm Jane Sayers. I've got a slightly ludicrous job title, which is Global Discipline Lead for Film at Shell. What that actually means is, I suppose, essentially head of film, if you like, within our main creative department at Shell. My background's actually as a documentary filmmaker. I've enjoyed a long and lovely career as a documentary filmmaker, and got into branded content a little bit as a maternity plan, actually, some years ago, and then eventually decided that that is what I would like to pursue, specifically rising to the challenge of getting my head around short form social media content rather than much longer form content, which is the kind of thing I was used to making. And as part of my role in Shell, we work with a multitude of different trusted suppliers around the world to make content for us. But we also set up 2 years ago our own Shell in-house film team, the Content Engine, which is doing very nicely. So yeah, that's me.
Great, thank you. And Naz, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Naz. I work at Merchant Cantos as part of our employee engagement team, and really sort of putting together teams to work on integrated campaigns across using a combination usually of film, design and digital as well. Previous to that, also at Merchant Cantos, I worked for a number of years as a senior film producer, making corporate films and CEO interviews. And in a former life before that, I worked in television journalism.
Great, thank you. And last but not least, Julie.
Hi there, I'm Julie. I work with Becky at Sequel. I'm a senior producer for film and content, and I also sit on our operations and strategic thinking teams to get a sort of overview, because we work in quite an integrated way across film, design, editorial, strategy to give a sort of full picture when it comes to employee engagement. And I think some of the things we'll be talking about later, which is that line between internal comms and what's needed there, and sometimes when there's a crossover, and we'll also do the occasional film that works for more than one audience. Like some of the others, I was in broadcasting before moving into more corporate and branded communications, and then through working as a producer director on BBC One City Hospital for a little while, I somehow ended up in health films, and then set up a film unit within a charity, which I did for 5 years before moving on to Sequel. So it's kind of interesting to have all that experience, and then to put that towards working with lots of different companies to get their messages across.
Oh, thank you, everyone. So to get us started, it's safe to say that, I mean, it goes without saying that it's been a weird few months, a weird year, and we've seen the working world change, possibly forever, with huge amounts of people working from home, other people dealing with new health and safety restrictions at their site, their clinic, their school, no matter where they might be working. Some people trying to juggle work with caring for kids who've been homeschooled. So how does internal comms fit into this new and maybe weird world of work? Why is it important? Naz, could you maybe start us off talking a bit about the importance of internal comms, particularly during this kind of strange new world?
Sure. I mean, I think we've seen internal comms generally move up the agenda within corporations anyway, and being seen as sort of essential part of achieving business success. And I think employee engagement, internal comms, no matter what you label it as, has become increasingly important. And then when everything happened with COVID and lockdown, then you saw that why that communication was needed. Now that everyone was split out, working in different sites and places and at home, it became even more important. So those companies that had good communication systems, processes, plans in place, they were able to react as, faster, more efficiently, and sort of get on top of it. And other people were on the back foot and had to do a lot of catching up to do. But communications became essential. So even companies that weren't doing regular communications suddenly had to get used to doing regular CEO updates on what are we doing about lockdown. So it's almost shifted up in the agenda over the last 6 months, but I think there's been a trend towards it becoming more important anyway.
Brilliant. And Jane, would you agree? Is that something that you've seen at Shell? Has it been moving up the agenda because of COVID, post-COVID?
I think at Shell, it probably has come up the agenda a little, perhaps not as much as it ought to. I think there's still an attitude that internal communication, certainly from a film perspective, are the poorer cousin. And we don't often see the same sorts of budgets associated with internal communications as we do external communications. And equally, we also see less production values for internal comms, and there's an acceptance about that. Whereas personally, from a professional film perspective, my team would love to see much nicer production values and more importance placed on that. So there are loads of different methods of communication, but I think we would certainly like to see more improvement yet.
Yeah. I mean, that's an interesting point, isn't it? Thinking about kind of the value organisations place on internal communications and the budget that they put towards it. Julie, working as we do in an agency, have you seen kind of any difference in terms of that? Are you finding that people are wanting to invest more in internal films as well as external?
There's a bit of a difference, I think, depending on the client as well. And there's, there's businesses where they have actually been going throughout the lockdown. So we've had some discussion. We've got one business where actually the business is funerals, and they've been really busy throughout, and they wanted to kind of communicate what was actually going on with the factory they have, where they actually make coffins. And we had some discussion about whether this should be done remotely, and whereas a lot of our clients have been quite happy to film themselves and send something in that actually wouldn't be as good quality as it would in other times when you'd actually send a crew, they were quite happy with that. And this company were kind of like, kind of along the lines of, well, we've been going in and we're still doing our jobs, why can't they come to us and film us? Why should we have to worry about filming ourselves and getting shots of things when there's someone we're doing it? Why shouldn't they? So in those circumstances, it's been a bit different, and we have been able to go in, whereas there's companies, like I said, that are doing things, everyone from home, perhaps in global locations. And for them, it's been really important to communicate, and people do want to see the CEO, and you can't necessarily get to them. They've been learning to film their own clips and doing that. And it's also film not as standalone, but as part of more regular comms, getting people to be a bit more involved, and using that to kind of get engagement. So encouraging people to maybe send in comments or send in their own clips as part of it, so that they can see each other and have that engagement.
Absolutely. So I think, as I just mentioned, you know, this kind of more siloed working world that we're seeing, that so many people are working differently from how they used to. They're probably even more geographically dispersed. It's trying to keep that kind of cohesive sense of community and culture in an organisation is even more important, and arguably even more difficult to keep people connected to that sense of purpose and their place in the bigger picture. Do you think that internal communication, and particularly video within that mix, can have a hand in helping create those connections and getting those kind of two-way interactions? I mean, Jane, do you have any experience of that with Shell? Has that been happening?
I think the key to getting that right is probably having episodic, predictable amounts of internal comms by video going out. I think if you think about it as a regular news update, or but regular items that people come to rely, that every second Friday at 2 p.m. they know there's going to be another installation. I think if you can get something like that going, then people are more likely to participate. And I think the key is getting that participation and making people feel like they can access, maybe not the CEO, but going up the ranks, in order to to have those kind of conversations. And I think that's a really great thing to do. We do see some of that at Shell. It's not half as regular, I think, as it should be, but I think particularly during this difficult period, episodic content is what we should be aiming for, and what we should be advising brands to embrace. Okay,
great. And in terms of, you mentioned in terms of getting participation in video, is that something any of you have seen? Have you found that people are more willing to get involved with video, or turn it into a more two-way piece of communication? Because obviously traditionally it might be a talking head just kind of pushed out. Are there ways that we can put video into that two-way channel and make it a bit more of a community thing? Julie, you were nodding a bit there.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say there's been some really nice things that we've been able to do that have been able to make people feel that they're part of a workplace community. Particularly earlier on in lockdown, when people were feeling a bit isolated, sending in views from their desk, which we've been able to then put together, whether it's been a photo montage that we've done with a bit of animation, or meals and things like that people have cooked, just to kind of be able to view what some other people have been doing, and maybe see yourself in there. And I think that's really helped people come together and got them a bit involved as well. And by putting those out regularly, you do build that sense of belonging to something, and not just being kind of separate people all over the place.
Yeah, definitely.
We've seen quite a lot of requests or advice to do like webcasts and live events and virtual events. and that's both obviously for external, but also for internal. It's actually worked quite well. And some businesses that weren't used to doing that regularly for internal audiences have been doing that. And it's worked quite well. But I think with having the films, whether it's films, animations, photo montage, it's how you package it up as a whole, and sort of producing the experience from start to finish. And by that, it's not just that 1 hour where you have the webinar. It's from the moment you send out the invite of why are we having this session, who's going to be there, producing that carefully so everyone knows, why am I turning up for 60 minutes, what's going to happen, and really spending some time to plan that out and to think about the content that goes into that 60 minutes rather than just having 60 minutes death by PowerPoint presentation. Everyone's working from home. I mean, there's just no way that's going to work. So really thinking about it and using examples. So that's where I think film can work really nicely and well in sort of short bit, a variation of film, and then you can mix it up with those PowerPoint presentations, and it works much more effectively. So there's quite a lot of that that we've seen and working really well, and people are launching new strategies, new visions, purpose, values, really big themes through this mechanism, and it's working really well.
Brilliant. So you mentioned there about obviously video integrating well in that kind of town hall presentation environment. Are there any other areas of internal communication that you think it can be integrated really well into, or any examples you've seen during lockdown or before, where things that wouldn't traditionally have been done via film or video in internal communication but have been done that way in a different way? Have you seen that at all?
Well, actually, when lockdown first happened, there were lots of we did a campaign just around MS Teams for a bit, because they were using the technology, but no one actually, they just thought it was a normal, teleconference type of platform, and so almost that was an education about what's the point and what you can do with MS Teams, what can you do with Yammer, and these sort of new ways of working. Animations, short films about there were new ways of working had seemed to be quite popular. But I think, as we mentioned, sometimes people who weren't putting leaders or managers weren't doing regular film updates or video updates. Now they are. So it's forcing everyone to get more engaged with film.
Brilliant. And Julie, Jane, are there any other examples that you might have of areas of internal communication where videos can make quite a big impact or can integrate with another channel?
We've seen quite a lot of people wanting animations, I think, to get their important information across, where perhaps it might have been a film previously, a filmed film with interviews and things like that. One of the things that we're able to do is perhaps use animation, archive footage and people's voices to get their messages across when we can't actually get out to film them in person. And also podcasts, I think, as well, are being asked for a bit more, because those are things that you can do without actually being there in the room with somebody. I think we might talk a bit later about the use of user-generated content, and that's something that has gone up hugely, things that we would have made with somebody in person and put that together. We're looking at ways that we can work with our clients to get the best out of that user-generated content, whether it's a bit of pre-production and working with them to make sure they film it properly, and often when people don't really want to because they've become used to just filming their own things and putting it out, to get the best from it perhaps by putting it within a frame or using some design or animation around it to make it very clear that it doesn't look how it might once have looked, because it's not been done in that way, but we've put it in a frame that shows a computer screen or a mobile phone, and you can see it playing within that, and it puts it into context. So those are the kind of things that we're doing.
Great. Yeah, I mean, continuing on that theme of user-generated content, as you said, it's with social distancing and lockdowns, it means that it's something that we're seeing a lot more of, and people are embracing more and more. I think, have you found, I mean, Jane, you mentioned you have an in-house video team. Have you found that you're asking people more to submit their own content and then you're using it? How have you been dealing with that for the past few months?
There's been an awful lot more of that, and some of it really quite ambitious as well. When lockdown happened, well, just before lockdown happened, one of our agencies was in the middle of a 2-day studio shoot, green screen studio shoot, and on day one, I beg your pardon, the medic turned up and started getting COVID symptoms. So he had been on set the day before with the crew on their prep day on the studio. So we had to pull the shoot immediately, send everybody home for 2 weeks of quarantine. So that gave us a conundrum because we had a film and no means of actually doing the shooting for it. So a big rethink. Sadly, we had to pull that one from the agency because it became clear the only way to do that would be by UGC. So instead, we relied on colleagues all over the world to film excerpts of themselves, which were pre-scripted, and it was a huge effort. I think we're getting more slick at doing it now because that's something that's coming up a lot for us.
Yeah.
One of the more ambitious films that we're working on at the moment that uses that method is actually the decommissioning of an oil platform a couple of 100 miles off the Scottish coast in the middle of the North Sea. So we were all geared up, ready to film that when lockdown happened. So we found an engineer who would be on board while the activity was taking place. And the team very carefully worked out what the scenes would be, the different people that would need to be interviewed, the different shots that we would need, worked with him to ensure that he was capable of understanding what we needed, and gave him a shot list and, you know, a really kind of well-guided, you know, list, if you like, and as much help as we could give him. And he came back with some great material. It's not what you would have got if you sent a 3-man crew, of course it's not, but it's certainly enough to make some compelling content. So yeah, we're pretty brave with that. It's really time consuming, you know, it's really time consuming to do that, to get it right. And I think also when you're doing that, you need to warn the people that are shooting for you about the fact that you are going to need to ask them to do some pickups, because then they're never going to get everything right first time. But we're employing that method very regularly at the moment. And it gives a different, you know, it's a very honest, very authentic way of making content, which feels quite fresh and, you know, honest.
So that theme of authenticity is something that we're hearing a lot about, and I mean, a couple of you have mentioned about how, you know, we've started to get more regular video updates from leaders, and they might be, you know, filming it or doing a kind of Teams call from their living room, and you might see their child or their dog in the background, and it's trying to kind of humanize people. Are you finding that employees are responding to more user-generated content? Are they liking it more? No change? I mean, Naz, have you had any experience at your organization with user-generated videos or not?
Yeah, I mean, you know, some organizations were doing using UGC before lockdown, and so they've continued. Some are still new to it. People are getting more used to it, but I think, as Jane said, I mean, the pre-production of UGC, often people think, oh, UGC must be the answer to every challenge, every comms challenge. Oh, I know, we'll do UGC. It's cheap, it's cheerful, it's easy. And it's not. It's not always the easiest or the best solution, but it's become a bit of a trend, I guess. And I think with other things generally around internal communications, we've got to go back to what are you trying to achieve with this piece of communications. And whereas with external, this is all perfectly always thought out. There's plans, you look at audience segmentation, outcomes, etc. With internal, it's like, oh, we've got to get this piece of information or strategy or whatever out there. I know UGC. And as Jane said in that example, I mean, it still requires to do it well, to reach that level of quality, requires a lot of work. Often you've got to send back the footage anyway the first time because it's not it's not good enough. So while people are getting more used to it, I think there is a danger that it all starts looking the same. and it becomes a bit vanilla. It's we've got to be careful of that and use it wisely, use it in the right ways, and it can be powerful and work well. But sometimes that, you know, maybe the answer is just an email. It doesn't have to be UGC. So I think it still needs to be worked out. But yeah, it's working well, and people are generally getting used to filming themselves even. Where before people might have been more reluctant to do that, now we're seeing more engagement on both sides.
Great. So Julie, sorry, did you have a point to make there?
Yeah, no, I was just going to say I agree with Naz in that people don't often realise the work that is involved with that user-generated content, and that often it's a bit of a false economy because it's the time that it takes up in post-production often to put it right, if it hasn't been set up properly in the first place, kind of can be a lot more than had you been able to shoot it, although obviously you're not always able to. But I think the other thing to say with these kind of different ideas and trends and little video clips sent in and user-generated is film, when it comes to internal comms, it's only ever a small part, and probably with all comms it's the same thing, but it's never the only way to get that message across, and people like to get their information in different ways, and different people learn things in different ways. So for someone it might totally bring a message to life to see it in the form of a film or an animation, but it has to be alongside those other comms, the longer article on an intranet that puts all the information in place, the email and all those other things that go with it.
Okay, great. So I mean, kind of touching on what all three of you said there, is there kind of, would you say there's an ideal time or type of content or type of message to use a video? Does it really depend on the audience? Do you have any kind of guidance that you put in place when deciding what kind of medium you should use for getting an internal communication message out there?
I think, as Julie said, I mean, it's that combination that often works the best, because usually with internal audiences, people lump that audience as one group. You know, everyone, they're just staff. You know, however many thousands of people there may or may not be, and I think. But actually, the reality is that there's generational differences, there's different levels of seniority, but also just some people don't. You know, some people are factory based and don't have access. Where are they going to watch this film that you're making? Or, you know, they don't even have access to these intranets. So you need that multiple touch points. And film is one touch point and it works well. But you often need all the other touch points as well, because it's often not the case where one film is, or anything, one poster is able to capture everything you want to capture in that communication. So it's that multiple layers of communication will help you get the outcome that you want. So it needs to work in combination and also consistent with all your other assets. Often what you see is people do a film about the same topic, and then another random poster gets put up somewhere else, and then an email goes out, and no one actually realizes in the organization that these three things are all related to the same topic. There's not that consistency in the look and feel or anything. So you just end up confusing people even more.
Great. So I think that also links in with you're talking about that consistency and aligning everything. What about the distinction between internal communication and external communication? So increasingly, I mean, I've probably been hearing it over the last 5 years or so that the lines are blurring between the two, and, you know, there's transferable skills, transferable messages. Have you found that to be the case? Jane, I'll start with you. Have you found that internal and external lines are blurring, particularly when it comes to video?
I think they probably are, and I think it's a good thing as well. I mean, the way that it's easy to think about it is a piece of external film will generally work for an internal audience, and we don't always think about it the other way around. And I think you've got to be cautious with that, because an internal film may well end up in front of an external audience, whether you mean for it to or not. which is where my argument for keeping production values really high comes in. And I think sometimes we overlook the external benefit of having good internal comms. So when you've got 90,000 people in a company, you can have 90,000 ambassadors for that company if you get your internal comms right. So if you're making quality films with great messaging, things that make employees feel proud to be a part of an organization, then you're winning externally as well. And there are some areas, I mean, Shell is difficult. We're an oil and gas company traditionally, and it's not exactly the most popular area of business. And in some territories, it's particularly difficult. In the UK and the Netherlands, Shell takes a regular bashing, less so in the States. But in India, where we have a lot of employees, they will actively promote anything that they can to do with their job. And it works as a fantastic recruitment tool as well in those areas. So I think, yeah, there's definitely much more crossover than there used to be, which should be embraced.
Brilliant. So yeah, Julie, is that something that you're seeing?
Yes, but I think there are cases when there's crossover, but I think what's really important is that it's about the message. So when it might be that a film will be made and it's internal and then an external team want it and can use it. But I think what's really important is the message, because sometimes it's a slightly different message and people will want to use something internally, externally, but it does need tweaking a bit to get the right message across. So there was one example recently where we had a client come to us for an internal film, and then it emerged that they had a client working on external comms who wanted something very similar. And then when we spoke to them, it turned out it was similar, but it wasn't quite the same thing. And it's actually ended up being 3 different films, 2 of which were quite similar and could have the same filming day, and one of which was totally different and needed to be done in a very different way. So it can be tweaked afterwards. It was great that we were able to have that conversation before anything was filmed so that we could get exactly what they wanted, because sometimes it's trying to put something that's, a round peg into a square hole, a square peg into a round hole, whichever it is, it doesn't always quite fit. So it's better if you can have those conversations beforehand, and then perhaps you can have those different versions in mind when you're actually planning it.
Okay, great, thank you. So yeah, at the beginning of our chat, we were talking about kind of the increased awareness of internal communications, and hopefully the increase in its value to organisations, or the way they perceive the value of it. Sorry. Do you think that this is something that's going to be maintained post COVID-19, whatever that may be, or do you think there's a danger that it might start to drop down the agenda again? Naz, do you have any thoughts about that?
I'm fairly hopeful it will stay. I think it has to, because I think Jane mentioned earlier about having that there's a sort of expectation that has been set here. So those businesses that are doing regular comms now, this is setting a new level of expectation, and the worst thing will be for that to then drop off all of a sudden. I mean, it seems like the world situation isn't going to change anytime soon. So while yes, there are constraints on budgets, and businesses are going through a really difficult time, so the communications and the responses need to be flexible and understanding of that, job losses, reduced budgets, there's all of that going on. But I think that's going to mean the need for more internal communications, not less. But of course, sensitivity to whatever budgets, for example. So I don't think it's going to completely drop off. I think hopefully it'll push up standards a little bit. But it's still going to be a challenge, probably against external comms in the long run. But hopefully things are, there's a new expectation for things to be of a higher quality and a higher standard.
Great, thank you. Jane, would you agree?
I do agree, yeah. I think perhaps what we, I almost daren't say it, but what we might see is that the money assigned to external comms is less. I think as people get used to UGC, and see that that's working effectively, I think there'll probably be a squeeze on budgets. But But let's see. I mean, people, you know, they're watching Netflix more than ever. They're watching great shows all the time. They're enjoying really good quality content. And that goes for external and internal people. You know, we are all viewers of brilliant content all the time. So, you know, we should have a certain expectation of the production values, and obviously budget and production value do go hand in hand. So I very much hope that budgets are not depressed terribly, both for internal and external. It would be nice as companies recover to start seeing that climbing again and getting back to the kind of content that we would all prefer to make.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so I mean, you mentioned there about everybody consuming great content all the time, and that is something, obviously, as we've been in lockdown and continued since then as people work from home, that we are finding more people like we are now are sitting in front of a screen. We might be using Teams, we might be using Skype, we might be at home watching Netflix or Prime. Do you think that there's a danger that people could start to feel a bit overwhelmed by the amount of video content they're facing? Or do you think that it's actually something that people are just going to welcome and appreciate more? Is there an issue of noise there?
I think it's finding the right content. There is a danger that there can be too much there and that it can be too long. I think probably people are getting a bit fed up with everything being online now, and having to have meetings over Zoom rather than in person and that kind of thing, and just having to look at a screen for such a long time to take in information. But so I think companies need to think really carefully about where it is needed and where it really can make a difference, and where it is worth actually investing some money in doing it properly. So I mentioned earlier about the film we'd been able to go to a factory where they actually make coffins, where they'd had a huge upsurge in production during the pandemic. So we were, because they were all there working anyway and thought we might as well go there in person and do the filming properly, we were able to make a really lovely film that actually brought that to life and showed what went on there. And what happened as a result was, I think on their intranet, it was the most popular film that they'd ever had in terms of engagement. And people around the country who were working within funeral homes, who were having to order the coffins from this factory, had never seen it in person, had never seen what actually happened there. Right. So it was really relevant to them. And even in normal times, they probably wouldn't be taking all the people from all their different branches on visits to actually go and see it. So for something like that, you can see why it's worth making the investment. And for other things, it probably still will be UGC and lots of Zoom meetings, and yeah, it is a lot to wade through. So it is something that needs to be carefully thought about and planned so that it's not too much. Yeah.
So are there any brands out there that you know that are doing internal videos or communication in general? Are there any kind of best in practice people that you've seen and are inspired by out there? You can raise your hand if you've seen any.
I think we've got lots of clients who've got it and are doing really well in terms of engagement and working out what's needed. And I think everyone's I think Naz mentioned earlier that some companies were doing it already, and those are the ones that have been able to hit the ground running, and others are learning. But I think it's been a big learning curve, and lots of people are doing some really good stuff internally to engage their people.
Great. We've got a question in the chat bot, so I will just go to that. So Nina asks, in a normal world, younger generations are potentially more concerned with the values of the company they are working for, and they're arguably equally important for internal as well as external comms. So in terms of ESG values, and brand values, so arguably that's likely to lead to more internal comms and higher production values. What does the panel think about that?
Yeah, I mean, we're definitely seeing quite a lot of requests and communication around values, communications around purpose. Both, I think that's related to ESG being, as mentioned, an important theme, but also because of lockdown and what's happened, everything is, I guess, changing. And these things are becoming important. So definitely purpose and brand. And it's not just, whereas ESG, people have been seeing it traditionally for investors and for external audiences. Now, as mentioned, it's just as important internally, and working together with those teams. And actually within businesses, the ESG team and the comms team and the ESG team and maybe HR or internal are working closer together because of that reason. And comms sometimes is bringing these groups that never spoke to each other together, because the ESG team weren't speaking to the values or the purpose team that may have been within HR, for example. And comms is where they can come together and work together. And as we've been saying, it can be both an external and an internal piece of communication.
Brilliant, thank you. So Julie, this is a question for you. How and when were you able to achieve filming access for the coffin film, given the COVID-19 measures? What were the key challenges in achieving that?
Oh, yes. So I think it was just as restrictions were starting to ease, and it was kind of the point where you can go to your place of work if you have to. So obviously risk assessment wise, we had to be very careful. We still put in place social distancing on the shoot, and they had social distancing in place in the factory. So we were staying 2 meters from each other at that time, because it was still 2 meters before they'd moved it to 1 meter. Wearing masks when we were inside. We used, instead of clip-on mics that we would usually use, we were using a mic on a stand that we placed, using a monitor so as not to have to stand. When doing interviews, it was a bit tricky and not standing too close to the cameraman. So yeah, there were more challenges than usual, even with booking accommodation for the shoot. Because most hotels and things were closed, I managed to find a cottage, and I think our MD was joking with me that you're going to find the 8-bedroom place with a pool, and it didn't have a pool, but I did end up having to get an 8-bedroom place for just 2 of us, which enabled this, and it was actually the only place that was available. I was kind of like, honestly, I haven't done this on purpose. It was the only place where it was possible to do it. So yeah, there are a lot more challenges than there would be normally, and it's making sure it's risk assessed and that we are very careful.
Great. With the people you were interviewing, just as a follow-up for that, did you have to kind of prep them beforehand and check that they were okay with going ahead with being interviewed in that kind of way?
So we've done a few shoots where we've been able to, so it wasn't just the one in the coffin factory, but I think all of them have been places where the people are still working. So some of them have been key workers, so they've been there throughout the pandemic, or they'd already gone back. But it's no different to how we would normally set up a shoot, in that I'd always speak to the people beforehand anyway, so that they know exactly what to expect, and we've got an idea about what their answers are likely to be to the questions, so that we can plan our shooting scripts properly and that kind of thing. So yeah, we'd always carefully plan it, but I think it was probably more important that we did speak to all those people in advance and make sure that everyone knew what was going to be happening and was comfortable with it.
Oh, Claire, you're on mute. Sorry, I can see your mouth moving.
Sorry, I was busy clicking on the wrong icon. So yes, there was I thinking I was quite on top of it, and I was not. Sorry, so I'm just leaping in at this point because we're approaching our closing time on this. So I just wanted to, actually, before we go, there's another question in here. You might want to answer that. The traditional assumption is that internal comms content is boring. How much pressure do you get from clients to come up with something exciting or engaging, dreaded word, and what do you find satisfies them? Do you find a lot of your internal content that succeeds takes influences from social media, e.g. Instagram, TikTok, or can it stay more highbrow than that? There's a lot in that question. Anyone got any sort of rapid fire answers?
Yeah, I can do a couple of rapid fire answers from a Shell perspective, very candidly. Our problem is not pressure to come up with something engaging and exciting. Our pressure is normally the other way round. People come to us with a very bland idea of what their internal communication should be. So we're always the ones that are pressing for something that is more engaging and exciting. And when we win, you know, it makes a massive impact and it works really well. So yeah, we're working in the reverse direction. Taking influence from social media, I would say a little, seeing a bit more fun, different styles coming into internal comms now, a little bit, not massively, and certainly probably most of what happens internally is still quite highbrow purely from a Shell perspective. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say I agree on that one, that not necessarily that it has to be very boring, but that people will come to us and it's not about create something necessarily that's great and creative and amazing, but this is a message that we really want to get across, and I think it's then our job to make it interesting and to come up with some ideas, and you know, they might not be expecting it, but I think we need to surprise them a bit and, you know, perhaps come up with a proposal that might not just have one idea, which is the basic idea, but maybe give them an option B and C, so they might be able to try something outside of the box that they weren't thinking of, and that we can make it a bit more exciting. They don't always want to, but at least we can try.
Naz, anything to add?
Yeah, I think just the basics of communications, right? Good stories, finding interesting stories, good storytelling still wins over, and in internal communications, that's just as important. And as you said, an element of surprise and creativity. But you know, it all goes back to good stories, and helping people find those good stories means that the content will be good and will speak for itself.
Absolutely right. Thank you very much. I would just add that if any of you have any resources or links to ideas and suggestions that you'd be happy to share with EVCOM members, do let us know, because we put that all on our website. We attach it to the article that Amelia writes following this event, you know, and it just makes it more of a, you know, a thought piece that people can refer back to